The silence in Julian Vance's house was a physical thing. It was a cold, heavy blanket woven from marble, glass, and the ghosts of laughter from a time long past. Outside, the world was a flurry of Christmas Eve excitement. Snow fell in fat, lazy flakes, dusting the manicured grounds of his estate in a layer of pristine white, muffling the distant sound of carolers and joyful shouts. But inside the grand walls of Vance Manor, there was no joy. There was only the low hum of the climate control system and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a hammer blow against the stillness. Julian stood before the vast, floor-to-ceiling window in his study, a glass of amber liquid held loosely in his hand. He was a man carved from sharp angles and cold efficiency, the kind of man whose photograph appeared in business magazines under headlines that spoke of ruthless acquisitions and market domination. Tonight, however, the CEO was gone. In his place was just a man, hollowed out by a grief so profound it had become the architecture of his life. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened glass, a tall, severe figure silhouetted against the opulent but lifeless room behind him. His gaze was fixed on the snow, but he did not see its beauty. He saw only the relentless, suffocating purity of it, a blank page laid over a story he could never bear to read again. 5 years. It had been 5 years to the day since the snow had been his enemy, since the pristine white had been stained with flashing red and blue lights. 5 years since the silence had first descended upon this house, not as a guest, but as its new and permanent master. On the polished mahogany desk behind him sat a single object, isolated from the neat stacks of corporate documents. It was a small, delicate music box, inlaid with mother-of-pearl. A ballerina, frozen mid-pirouette, was poised on its lid. It had been Eleanor's last gift to him, the one she had been bringing home that night. He had found it in the wreckage, miraculously intact, a cruel souvenir from the end of his world. He never opened it. He couldn't bear to hear the melody. A swell of rage, bitter and familiar, rose in his chest. It was a venomous tide that clawed at his throat, demanding release. He turned from the window, his jaw tight, his knuckles white around the glass. The festive cheer from the distant town felt like a personal insult, a garish celebration on the anniversary of his despair. Every twinkling light, every cheerful song, was a mockery. "I hate Christmas," he snarled, the words tearing from him in a raw, ragged whisper that was swallowed by the cavernous room. He wanted to shout it, to scream it until the crystal chandeliers shattered and the very foundations of the house cracked. He wanted the world to know the depth of his loathing for this season of supposed joy. It took everything. It took my wife. He slammed the glass down on the desk, the sharp crack of it against the wood echoing the fracturing of his composure. The silence that followed was even heavier than before, thick with the weight of his uttered pain. A few hundred yards away, nestled at the edge of the sprawling Vance estate, was a small stone cottage that seemed to have been forgotten by time. It was a tiny, unassuming dwelling, dwarfed by the grandeur of the manor that loomed like a dark mountain behind it. But where the manor was cold and silent, the cottage glowed with a warm, buttery light that spilled from its windows onto the snow. Inside, the air was filled not with silence, but with the scent of cinnamon and the sound of soft, happy humming. Clara Hay sat at a small wooden table, a pair of scissors in her hand, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was carefully cutting a folded piece of paper, her movements precise and gentle. Around her, the room was a testament to making a home from very little. A threadbare but clean rug covered the floor. A small, lopsided fir tree stood in the corner decorated with handmade ornaments, and a cheerful fire crackled in the hearth, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. It was modest, but it was a haven. Across from her sat her entire world, a 5-year-old girl with hair the color of spun gold and eyes as wide and curious as a forest creature's. Lily Hayes was meticulously applying glitter to a paper star, her tongue sticking out from the corner of her mouth in a display of intense focus. She was a child who found magic in the mundane, who saw wonder in a snowflake and friendship in a sunbeam. "Look, Mommy," Lily said, holding up her creation. A cascade of silver glitter rained down onto the table in her lap. "I made a wishing star. I'm going to wish for a real Christmas angel to put on our tree." Clara smiled, a genuine, tired smile that reached her eyes. It's beautiful, sweetie. The most beautiful star I've ever seen. She reached across the table and brushed a stray bit of glitter from her daughter's cheek. They had so little, especially this year after a sudden move had left them in this rented cottage with barely enough to get by. But they had this. They had the warmth of the fire and the magic of a glittery paper star. They had each other. It was then that a sound pierced their cozy bubble. It was faint, carried on the wind, a sound of deep, masculine anguish. A shout. Lily's head popped up, her glittery hands frozen in the air. Her big blue eyes blinked. What was that? Clara paused, listening. She had heard it too. It sounded like it came from the big, dark house on the hill, the one the locals whispered about. The home of the reclusive Mr. Vance, a man no one ever saw. It's just the wind, honey, she said, trying to sound reassuring. She didn't want anything to frighten her daughter, especially not on Christmas Eve. But Lily was not easily dissuaded. She was a child who operated on a different frequency, one tuned to the quiet sadness of the world. She slid off her chair. It sounded like someone was sad, Mommy. Really, really sad. Before Clara could stop her, Lily scurried to the front door, her curiosity a force of nature. She pulled on her little red boots and her thick, puffy coat, her small hands fumbling with the zipper. Lily, wait. It's cold outside, Clara called, rising from her chair. But Lily was already out the door, a tiny figure in a bright pink coat against the vast white expanse of snow. She wasn't running toward the town. She was trudging with purpose directly toward the dark, silent mansion on the hill, drawn by a sound of pain that only she seemed to truly understand. Her mother's heart leaped into her throat as she watched her small daughter march toward the home of a man known only for his wealth and his sorrow. Julian was still standing by his desk, his hand resting on the cool, smooth lid of the music box. The echo of his own voice still hung in the air, a shameful testament to his loss of control. He was a man who prized control above all else. He built empires on it. Yet every year, on this day, it crumbled to dust, leaving him exposed and raw. He closed his eyes, picturing Eleanor's smile, the way her eyes would light up when she saw the first snowfall of the season. The memory was a sharp, physical pain, a phantom limb that ached for a touch that would never come again. A soft, rhythmic sound broke through his reverie. Thump, thump, thump. It was a small, hesitant noise, almost lost in the sheer scale of the house. He frowned, opening his eyes. Who would dare come to his door? On Christmas Eve of all nights. He had given his staff the holiday off, save for his butler, Abernathy, who was likely in his own quarters at the back of the house. No deliveries were scheduled. No visitors were ever expected. Thump, thump, thump. It came again, a little more insistent this time. A flicker of irritation cut through his grief. He strode from the study, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor of the grand foyer. The front doors were massive, carved from dark oak, designed to intimidate and impress. He reached them and pulled one open with a sharp, angry tug, ready to dismiss whoever had the audacity to disturb him. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine and snow. He looked down, and then he froze. There on his doorstep, barely reaching his waist, stood a little girl. She was bundled in a pink coat so puffy she looked like a marshmallow, with a red hat pulled down over her ears and a bright green scarf wrapped around her neck. Snowflakes clung to her eyelashes, and her nose was cherry red from the cold. She was staring up at him with eyes so large and so serious that he felt, for a moment, like he was the child and she was the elder. He stared, utterly speechless. His mind, so adept at complex negotiations and billion-dollar deals, could not process this tiny, unexpected variable. Children did not exist in his world. Not anymore. They were part of the life that had been stolen from him, a ghost of a future that had vanished in a storm of snow and twisted metal. The little girl tilted her head, her expression one of profound, innocent curiosity. She did not seem intimidated by his height, by the darkness of the house behind him, or by the thunderous scowl he was certain was etched on his face. She simply looked at him, as if she were seeing right through the layers of wealth and anger to the broken thing huddled inside. "Why do you hate Christmas?" she asked. Her voice was small but clear, the question direct and utterly devoid of judgment. "It has pretty lights. And hot chocolate. Julian's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. He had expected a solicitor, a lost tourist, anyone but this. He had no answer for her. How could he explain a grief that was older than she was to a creature made of pure, unadulterated wonder? He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He just stood there, a giant frozen in place by a question from a fairy tale. Just then, a frantic voice called out from the darkness. "Lily!" "Oh, thank goodness." "Lily!" Clara came running up the long driveway, her own coat thrown hastily over her shoulders, her face pale with panic. She stopped short when she saw her daughter standing on the CEO's doorstep, talking to the formidable Julian Vance, as if he were a long-lost friend. Mortification washed over her. "I am so sorry, Mr. Vance," she stammered, rushing forward and grabbing Lily's hand. She ran out. "I turned my back for a second. We're new to the cottage next door. I am so terribly sorry to have disturbed you." She was rambling, her words tumbling over one another in her haste to apologize and retreat. She tugged gently on Lily's hand. But Lily didn't budge. She kept her wide, serious eyes fixed on Julian's face. "He's sad, Mommy," she whispered, her voice carrying in the still night air. "That's why he yelled." The child's simple, devastatingly accurate assessment struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. He felt the ice around his heart crack, just a little. He looked from the terrified mother to the fearless child. He saw the cold nipping at their cheeks, the snow beginning to collect on their shoulders. His own house was warm. Empty, but warm. The instinct to close the door, to retreat back into his silent fortress, warred with a long-dormant impulse he barely recognized. It was the echo of Eleanor's voice, the memory of her boundless compassion. "It is cold," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The words felt foreign in his mouth. He cleared his throat. "You should come inside. Just for a moment. To get warm." Clara's eyes widened in surprise. This was not the reaction she had expected from the grim recluse of Vance Manor. She expected anger, a stern dismissal. Not this gruff, reluctant invitation. "Oh, no, we couldn't possibly impose," she began. But Julian had already stepped back, holding the massive door open wider. The gesture was stiff, awkward, but it was undeniable. "It is not an imposition," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The child is cold." He looked at Lily, whose small hand was still held firmly in her mother's. A tiny shiver ran through her frame. Clara looked at her daughter, then back at the imposing man in the doorway. Against her better judgment, against every instinct that told her to run from this man's palpable sadness, she found herself nodding. She let him lead them out of the cold night and into the vast, echoing silence of his home. The foyer was larger than their entire cottage. A grand staircase swept upwards into darkness, and the marble floor gleamed under a single, ornate chandelier. The air was cool and smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. It was a museum, not a home. There were no photographs on the walls, no stray coats or shoes, no signs of life whatsoever. It was as if the entire house were holding its breath. Julian closed the door, shutting out the snow and the night. The sound echoed in the cavernous space, making Lily jump slightly. He seemed to notice her reaction, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his features. "This way," he said, his voice still low and gruff. He led them not into one of the formal, intimidating rooms off the foyer, but down a long hall toward the back of the house. They entered a vast kitchen, a modern expanse of stainless steel and dark granite. It was immaculate, clearly the domain of a professional staff, yet it felt just as cold and unused as the rest of the house. Julian gestured toward a small table and chairs tucked into a breakfast nook that overlooked the darkened gardens. "Please, sit." Clara and Lily sat, feeling like two small sparrows who had accidentally flown into a cathedral. Lily's feet, in their bright red boots, dangled high above the floor. Julian moved to the large, professional-grade stove, his movements stiff and unfamiliar. He opened a refrigerator that was nearly empty, save for a few bottles of water and a carton of milk. He pulled out the milk, then searched through several pristine cupboards before finally locating a tin of cocoa powder. He worked in silence, his back to them. Clara watched him, her heart a confusing mix of apprehension and a strange, aching sympathy. He moved like a man who was a stranger in his own home. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself with a rigid control that seemed on the verge of snapping. This was a man drowning in a sea of his own making, and her daughter had just thrown him a lifeline in the form of a simple question. Lily, meanwhile, was taking in her surroundings with wide-eyed wonder. She seemed unbothered by the opulence or the coldness. She was simply present. "You have a very big house," she announced to Julian's back. He paused in his task of stirring milk in a saucepan. "Yes," he replied, without turning around. "Is it lonely?" she asked. Clara's breath hitched. "Lily," she whispered, a gentle reprimand. But the question was already out there, hanging in the sterile air of the kitchen. Julian stopped stirring. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, the silence stretching until it was taut. Clara held her breath, bracing for the explosion of anger she was sure would come. Finally, he spoke, his voice so quiet she could barely hear it. "Yes," he said. "It is." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. That one word was a confession, a window into a well of solitude so deep it was bottomless. He finished preparing the hot chocolate and poured it into 2 delicate porcelain mugs that seemed far too fancy for the occasion. He placed them on the table, his large, capable hands looking out of place as they handled the fragile china. He hadn't made one for himself. He simply stood there, leaning against the counter, observing them as if they were a strange species he was studying. Lily wrapped her small hands around the warm mug, a look of pure bliss on her face as she took a careful sip. "Thank you, Mr. Sadman," she said, her voice muffled by the rim of the cup. Clara nearly choked. "Her name is Lily," she said quickly, trying to smooth over her daughter's unfiltered honesty. "And my name is Clara. And you are Mr. Vance." "He's Mr. Sadman," Lily insisted quietly, not with malice, but with the simple finality of a child's observation. To Clara's astonishment, the corner of Julian's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, not even close, but it was the first crack in his stone-like facade. "Julian," he corrected, his voice a low rumble. "My name is Julian." They sat in that quiet, warm space for a little while longer. Lily chattered on about her paper star and her wish for a Christmas angel, her innocent voice a stark contrast to the house's oppressive silence. Clara tried to keep her daughter's boundless energy in check, but Julian seemed not to mind. He just watched and listened, his expression unreadable, his posture rigid. Yet, something had shifted in the room. A tiny pinprick of light had appeared in the vast darkness of his home. When the hot chocolate was finished, Clara knew it was time to go. They had imposed long enough. "Thank you so much for your kindness, Mr. Vance." "Julian," she said, standing and helping Lily from her chair. "We should be going. Merry Christmas." The words seemed to hang in the air, a phrase so antithetical to the atmosphere of the house. Julian simply nodded, his face once again a mask of grim neutrality. He led them back through the silent halls to the front door. As he opened it, a gust of wind sent a swirl of snow into the foyer. Lily, however, was not quite finished. She turned back to him, her small face serious. She reached into the pocket of her puffy coat and pulled out a slightly crumpled, glitter-covered paper snowflake. She held it out to him on her small, mittened hand. "This is for you," she said, "so your house won't be so empty." Julian stared at the simple, imperfect paper creation as if it were a foreign artifact. He hesitated, then slowly, carefully, he reached out and took it from her. His large fingers, which signed contracts worth millions, looked clumsy as they held the delicate piece of paper. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything. He just looked from the snowflake to the little girl who had given it to him. Clara gently guided Lily out the door. "Good night," she said softly, and then they were gone, 2 small figures disappearing back into the snowy night. Julian stood in the open doorway for a long time, the cold air washing over him, staring at the tiny, glittery snowflake resting in the palm of his hand. He felt a strange, unfamiliar ache in his chest. It was not the familiar pain of grief. It was something else entirely. It was the first thaw after a long, brutal winter. The days that followed that strange Christmas Eve encounter unfolded in a way Julian could never have predicted. He had expected to retreat back into his fortress of solitude, to let the memory of the woman and her child fade like a brief, peculiar dream. He had placed the paper snowflake on the mantelpiece in his study, a stark white shape against the dark wood, and tried to forget. But he could not. The silence of his house now felt different. Before, it had been a familiar companion. Now it felt like an absence. He found himself listening for the sound of a child's high, clear voice, for the soft, hesitant footsteps of a woman trying not to impose. He would walk past the kitchen and remember the sight of Lily's small red boots dangling from the chair. The house was no longer just empty, it was lonely. The distinction was a revelation, and it was deeply unsettling. 2 days after Christmas, he was staring out his study window when he saw them. Clara and Lily were in the small yard of their cottage, attempting to build a snowman. It was a pathetic-looking thing, lopsided and small, made from the thin, powdery snow. Lily was trying to stick a carrot into its face, but kept dropping it. Clara was laughing, a sound he couldn't hear but could easily imagine. He watched them for a long time, a strange pull in his chest. He acted on an impulse he did not understand. He went to his garage, a pristine showroom for cars he rarely drove, and opened the trunk of his large SUV. Inside was a massive, perfectly shaped fir tree, one his staff had purchased for the manor before he had angrily ordered them to get rid of it. He had intended to have it disposed of, but had never gotten around to it. Now, it seemed to have a purpose. He drove the short distance to the cottage, the expensive car looking absurdly out of place on the humble gravel path. He got out, his movements stiff and formal. Clara and Lily stopped their snowman building and stared at him, their eyes wide. "This tree," he said, his voice a low growl to cover his own uncertainty. "It is too large for my house. It is a fire hazard. I was going to throw it away. You should take it." It was a clumsy, transparent lie, but it was the only thing he could think of. Clara looked from the enormous, beautiful tree to the tiny, lopsided one in her living room window. She opened her mouth to protest, to say they couldn't possibly accept such a gift, but Lily beat her to it. The little girl's face lit up with a joy so pure and radiant, it was like the sun breaking through clouds. "A real Christmas tree," she squealed, running toward him. "Mommy, look. Julian brought us a real Christmas tree." And so, he spent the next hour helping them set up the tree in their tiny living room. It was far too big, its branches brushing against the ceiling and walls, but it filled the small space with the glorious, fresh scent of pine. He found himself on his knees, securing the tree in its stand, while Lily danced around him, chattering excitedly. Clara directed him with a quiet, gentle grace, a soft smile playing on her lips. For the first time in 5 years, Julian Vance was participating in Christmas. The realization was both terrifying and strangely wonderful. That one act of awkward charity became a bridge. The following day, Clara appeared at his door with a plate of freshly baked cookies, a thank you for the tree. Lily was with her, holding a drawing she had made. It was a wobbly, colorful picture of a very tall, frowning man, a small smiling girl, and a giant green triangle. "That's you, and me, and our tree," she explained seriously, pointing with a small finger. He accepted the drawing and the cookies with a quiet nod, and invited them in for more hot chocolate. A fragile routine began to form. Every few days, they would visit. Lily's laughter started to chip away at the house's silence. Clara's quiet presence began to smooth over the sharp, empty edges of his life. They would talk, not about anything deep or important, but about simple things. Lily's favorite color, the book Clara was reading, the birds they saw at the feeder outside the kitchen window. He found himself listening, truly listening, for the first time in a very long time. He learned about her life in small, careful pieces. She was a widow, her husband lost to a sudden illness a few years prior. She was a freelance graphic designer, working late at night after Lily was asleep, struggling to make ends meet. She was resilient and kind, carrying her own burdens with a quiet strength that he found himself inexplicably drawn to. She never asked him for anything, never pried into his life. She simply accepted his presence, his silence, his sadness, without question. One evening, they were sitting in his study. A fire crackled in the hearth, a concession he had made to Lily, who had declared the room too spooky without it. The warmth and flickering light transformed the space, making the shadows softer, less menacing. Lily was asleep on the plush rug, her head pillowed on a cushion, her drawing of the three of them clutched in her hand. Clara was looking into the flames, her expression thoughtful. "This is a beautiful room," she said softly. "It must hold a lot of memories." Julian followed her gaze to the mantelpiece. Next to Lily's paper snowflake sat the pearl-inlaid music box. He had not moved it. He had not touched it. But its presence was a constant, silent scream. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to tell her, to give voice to the grief that had kept him a prisoner for so long. "My wife, Eleanor, she designed this room," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "She loved this house. She said it had good bones, but no heart. She was going to fill it with heart." Clara turned to look at him, her eyes full of a deep, compassionate understanding. She didn't speak. She just waited, giving him the space to continue. "She loved Christmas," he said, the words tasting like ash. "She would spend weeks decorating, baking. She said it was the one time of year the world felt as magical as it was supposed to." He paused, the memories washing over him. 5 years ago, on Christmas Eve, she was driving home. There was a storm. A patch of black ice. His voice broke, and he stopped, unable to go on. He stared at the music box, the symbol of everything he had lost. "She was bringing me that. My gift." He finally looked at Clara. He expected to see pity in her eyes, but instead, he saw a shared sorrow. He saw empathy. She reached out, her hand hovering in the air for a moment before she gently placed it over his on the arm of the chair. Her touch was light, warm, and profoundly grounding. It was the first time a woman had touched him with such tenderness in 5 years. "I'm so sorry, Julian," she whispered. "I can't imagine the pain." "The pain is constant," he admitted, the confession costing him more than any business deal ever had. "But the silence is worse. This house, it used to be filled with her laughter, with her music. After she was gone, the silence was all that was left." He looked over at the sleeping form of her daughter. "Until you came." In that quiet, firelit moment, the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart crumbled just a little bit more. He had shared the source of his wound, and instead of recoiling, she had met him there with gentle acceptance. He looked at Clara, at the warmth in her eyes, and at Lily, a small beacon of innocent life asleep by the fire, and felt a dangerous, terrifying flicker of hope. He was beginning to realize that they weren't just visitors in his house. They were slowly, quietly, becoming its heart. The new year arrived, and with it, a subtle but profound shift in their dynamic. The visits became a natural part of their lives. Julian found himself structuring his days around them. He would leave board meetings early, citing vague but non-negotiable appointments, just to be home in time for Lily to show him a new drawing or for Clara to share a cup of tea with him. The staff, long accustomed to his rigid isolation, exchanged knowing, hopeful glances. Mr. Vance was changing. The mansion itself seemed to be waking from a long slumber. Julian, at Lily's persistent request, had allowed more lights to be turned on. He'd had the dusty covers removed from the furniture in the grand living room. One afternoon, he had walked in to find Clara sitting at the grand piano, tentatively playing a simple, beautiful melody. He had stood in the doorway, unseen, and listened, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. It was the first time music had been played in that room since Eleanor. It didn't hurt as much as he thought it would. It felt right. His feelings for Clara deepened from a quiet appreciation into something more potent and unnerving. He admired her resilience, her unwavering kindness in the face of her own struggles. He was captivated by the way she saw the world, finding beauty in small, overlooked things. He started to notice the little details. The way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the soft, melodic cadence of her voice when she read stories to Lily, the genuine warmth of her smile that seemed to light up even the darkest corners of his home. This burgeoning happiness was a foreign country, and he was a terrified visitor. He felt disloyal. He felt as though every smile he shared with Clara, every moment of peace he felt in her presence, was a betrayal of Eleanor's memory. Grief had been his identity for so long. He didn't know who he was without it. Was it possible to honor the love he had lost while embracing a new one? The question haunted his sleepless nights. The true test came in the form of a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was an invitation to the annual Vance Corporation Winter Gala, a lavish event he had avoided for the past 5 years. This year, for reasons he couldn't articulate, he felt a pull to go. More than that, he felt a desperate, a logical urge to take Clara with him. He wanted to show her that side of his life, but more importantly, He wanted to walk into that room with her by his side. He asked her one afternoon, his request stilted and awkward. It is a corporate function. Mandatory. It would be less tedious with company. He couldn't bring himself to say, I want you to be there with me. Clara was taken aback. The world of corporate galas was as alien to her as the surface of the moon. She owned nothing suitable to wear, and the thought of being surrounded by the city's elite was intimidating. Julian, I don't think. I'll take care of everything, he said quickly, cutting off her protest. And he did. A personal shopper delivered a selection of elegant, understated gowns to her cottage. He arranged for a trusted member of his staff to babysit Lily. He handled every detail with his signature efficiency, steamrolling her gentle objections until she found herself, much to her own surprise, agreeing to go. The night of the gala, when he arrived at her cottage to pick her up, he was rendered speechless. She was standing in her small living room, wearing a deep sapphire gown that shimmered under the warm light. Her hair was swept up, and she looked so breathtakingly beautiful, so poised and elegant, that he felt the air leave his lungs. He saw not a struggling single mother, but a woman of incredible grace and strength. The evening started well. The ballroom was a glittering spectacle of crystal and silver, but with Clara by his side, it felt less like a cage and more like a stage. He introduced her simply as Clara Hayes, letting people draw their own conclusions. He was aware of the curious glances, the whispered conversations, but he didn't care. For the first time, he felt a flicker of pride, a desire to show her off to a world that had only ever known him as a grieving recluse. The trigger came unexpectedly. They were standing near the terrace, a glass of champagne in his hand, when an old business acquaintance, a man named Marcus Thorne, approached them. Marcus had known Eleanor. Julian, good to see you out and about, Marcus said, his voice oozing a false sincerity. His eyes flickered over Clara, a dismissive, judgmental gleam in them. And you found a replacement for the decorations this year, I see. Very charming. The word replacement struck Julian like a physical blow. It was the articulation of his deepest, darkest fear. The casual cruelty of the remark, the way it reduced Clara to an object and Eleanor's memory to mere decoration, ignited a cold fury in him. But beneath the anger, guilt surged, suffocating and absolute. Marcus was right. What was he doing? He was trying to replace the irreplaceable. He was trying to paper over his grief with a new, convenient happiness. He saw the flicker of pain in Clara's eyes before she masked it with a polite, neutral expression. He wanted to defend her, to lash out at Marcus, but he was paralyzed. His own internal demons were screaming louder than his protective instincts. The glittering ballroom suddenly felt suffocating. Every smiling face seemed to mock him. He saw Eleanor everywhere, in the sparkle of a diamond necklace, in the strain of a waltz, in the ghost of a memory. He turned to Clara, his own face a mask of cold stone. The warmth that had been between them just moments before had vanished, replaced by an arctic chill. I need some air, he said, his voice clipped and distant. He left her standing there, alone and exposed, and walked out onto the freezing terrace. The rest of the evening was a disaster. He was silent, withdrawn, a stranger once more. The drive back to her cottage was thick with a tense, unbearable silence. Clara didn't know what to say, what she had done wrong. She felt the sting of public humiliation and the deeper pain of his sudden, brutal rejection. When they pulled up to her cottage, he didn't get out of the car. He kept his hands on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the darkness ahead. This was a mistake, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. All of it. I can't do this. Clara's heart shattered. Julian, what are you talking about? What happened? He finally looked at her, and his eyes were the eyes of the man who had first opened his door to her, cold, distant, and filled with a pain so immense it left no room for anyone else. I am not a man who gets a second chance, he said, his voice rough with self-loathing. I live with ghosts. It's not fair to you. It's not fair to her memory. He was pushing her away, building the walls back up, brick by painful brick. He believed he was protecting her, but all he was doing was breaking her heart. So that's it, she whispered, her voice trembling. You're just ending this. There was nothing to end, he said, the words a final, cruel twist of the knife. He couldn't see the tears welling in her eyes. He couldn't allow himself to. He had to be cold. He had to be decisive. It was the only way to sever the connection, to retreat back to the safety of his misery. Clara got out of the car without another word. She didn't slam the door. She closed it softly, a gesture of quiet dignity that was somehow more damning than any angry outburst would have been. He watched her walk up the path and disappear into the warm light of her cottage. Then he drove away, the tires crunching on the gravel, leaving her alone in the cold, just as he had found her. He had run back to the prison of his past, and he had locked the door behind him. The silence that descended on Vance Manor this time was worse than ever before. It was no longer a passive entity. It was an active, malevolent presence. It was filled with the ghosts of what might have been, the echo of Lily's laughter, the phantom scent of Clara's cookies, the memory of her hand on his. Julian retreated into his work, burying himself in spreadsheets and market analyses, but there was no escape. Every quiet moment was a torment, filled with the memory of Clara's hurt face. He had convinced himself he had done the right thing, the noble thing. He was a damaged man, his heart a ruin. He had no right to drag Clara and her innocent daughter into the wreckage of his life. He was protecting them from his darkness. But as the days bled into a week, a cold, hard truth began to dawn on him. He hadn't been protecting them. He had been protecting himself. He had been protecting his grief, the familiar, suffocating blanket he had wrapped around himself for 5 years. He was a coward, afraid of the very happiness he had so briefly tasted. Clara, meanwhile, was trying to piece her heart back together. The rejection had been swift and brutal, leaving her feeling foolish and exposed. She had allowed herself to hope, to dream of a future that included the quiet, sad man on the hill. She had seen the good in him, the deep well of kindness beneath the frosty exterior. She had thought, perhaps, that she and Lily could be the ones to help him heal. But she had been wrong. She packed away the beautiful sapphire gown, a painful reminder of her own naivety. She told Lily that Mr. Julian was very busy with his work and wouldn't be able to visit for a while. Lily, with her child's intuition, knew it was more than that. The light had gone out of her mother's eyes. The easy laughter that usually filled their small cottage was gone, replaced by a quiet, pervasive sadness. And she missed her friend. She missed the big, quiet house and the man who looked so sad but always listened to her stories. One afternoon, as Clara was trying to focus on a design project, her mind adrift in a sea of hurt, Lily sat at the kitchen table with her craft supplies. She was humming softly to herself, a look of intense concentration on her face. She was folding a piece of white paper, adding bits of gold foil and a halo made from a pipe cleaner. "What are you making, sweetie?" Clara asked, her voice weary. "It's a Christmas angel," Lily announced, holding it up. It was simple, a little crooked, but made with obvious love. "It's for Julian's lonely angel, so she won't be alone in that big house." Clara's heart ached. She remembered Julian's confession about his wife, Eleanor. Lily had clearly overheard and processed it in her own unique, compassionate way. "Oh, honey, that's so sweet. But we can't bother him right now." "But she's lonely," Lily insisted, her lower lip trembling slightly. "She needs a friend." On a scrap of paper, she carefully printed a message, asking her mom for help with the spelling. It said, "For your angel, so she won't be alone." Lily. Clara didn't have the heart to say no. That evening, under the cloak of twilight, she walked with Lily to the edge of the manor's driveway. She wouldn't go to the door. She couldn't bear to face him. But she let Lily run up the long path, place the small paper angel and the note on the immense doorstep, and run back. It was a final, innocent farewell. Julian found the offering when he went to retrieve his newspaper the next morning. He saw the small, white object on his doormat and bent down to pick it up. He recognized Lily's handiwork instantly. He unfolded the small, crumpled note. "For your angel, so she won't be alone." The simple, profound words shattered the last of his defenses. He stood there on his cold, marble step, the paper angel in his hand, and finally understood. Lily wasn't just talking about Eleanor. She was talking about him. He was the lonely one. He had built a shrine to his grief and, in doing so, had exiled himself from the living. He had been so afraid of betraying Eleanor's memory that he had failed to see the truth. The greatest betrayal would be to let the love she had taught him die with her. Eleanor, who had filled his life with light and laughter, would never have wanted him to live in this self-imposed darkness. He looked from the paper angel to the small, warm cottage glowing in the distance. He saw it all with a sudden, painful clarity. He had been given a second chance, a rare and precious gift delivered by a 5-year-old girl. And he, in his fear and cowardice, had thrown it away. A wave of panic, far greater than the one he had felt at the gala, washed over him. What if it was too late? What if he had broken something that could not be repaired? He didn't wait. He didn't change out of his expensive suit. He ran. He ran down the long driveway, his polished shoes slipping on the icy patches, his heart hammering in his chest. He ran toward the light, toward the one small beacon of hope in his desolate world. He had to fix this. He had to fight for the family he had so foolishly pushed away. He had to choose life. He reached the door of the cottage, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't knock. He pounded on the door, a desperate, frantic rhythm. "Clara, please, open the door. It's Julian." The door opened a crack, and Clara's face appeared, pale and wary. Her eyes were shadowed, and he saw the deep hurt he had inflicted etched upon her features. The sight of it was a knife in his gut. "Julian, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice quiet but strained. "I was wrong," he said, the words tumbling out of him in a desperate rush. "I was a fool, a coward. Everything I said. I was so wrong. I was afraid. I was so afraid of being happy again that I destroyed the first real happiness I've felt in 5 years." He held up the paper angel. "Lily, she made me see. I've been living in a tomb of my own making. I don't want to live there anymore. I want to live here, with you." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, tears of confusion and hurt and a fragile, burgeoning hope. "I don't understand. You said—" "I know what I said," he interrupted, taking a step closer. "I was trying to protect you, but I was just hurting you. And myself. Clara, you are not replacing anyone. You could never replace Eleanor. You are creating something new. You're bringing me back to life. You and Lily." He reached out, his hand shaking, and gently cupped her cheek. "Please, can you forgive me? Please give me another chance. Let me show you. Let me be the man you both deserve." Behind Clara, Lily appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide. "Are you done being sad, Julian?" she asked. Julian looked down at the little girl who had started it all. He knelt, so he was at her eye level. A real, genuine smile finally broke through his grim facade, transforming his face. "Yes, Lily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "With your help, I think I'm done being sad." He looked back up at Clara, his heart in his eyes. "Please, let me stay. Let me be part of your world. I love you, Clara. I think I have from the moment you stood on my doorstep and apologized for your daughter's beautiful, honest heart." A tear slipped down Clara's cheek, but this time, it was not a tear of sadness. She looked at this man, so broken and so beautiful, and saw not a wealthy CEO, but a man fighting his way back to the light. She saw a future she had not dared to dream of. She nodded, a slow, single movement that sealed their fate. "Yes," she whispered. "Stay." He rose to his feet and wrapped her in his arms, holding her as if he would never let go, the small paper angel still clutched safely in his hand. 1 year later, the snow fell again on Christmas Eve, dusting the grounds of Vance Manor in a familiar blanket of white. But this year, the great house was not dark and silent. Every window blazed with warm, welcoming light, spilling out onto the pristine snow. The sound of joyful laughter and Christmas music drifted on the cold night air, a beacon of life and love. Inside, the grand living room, once a cold and sterile space, was utterly transformed. A magnificent fir tree stood in the corner, covered in a chaotic and wonderful assortment of ornaments, gleaming glass balls next to handmade paper creations, shimmering tinsel alongside strings of popcorn. A fire roared in the hearth, casting a golden glow on the scene. The house was no longer holding its breath. It was breathing, living, laughing. Julian was on the floor, sprawled on the plush rug, his suit jacket and tie discarded. He was helping Lily build an elaborate castle out of brightly colored blocks. His face, which had once been a mask of grim sorrow, was relaxed and open, etched with laugh lines he hadn't had a year ago. He was completely absorbed in the task, his brow furrowed in concentration as he placed a final turret on the very top of their creation. "There," he said with a grin of triumph. A castle fit for a princess. Lily giggled, a sound that was now the manor's most precious music. "You're the king, Julian," she declared, placing a lopsided paper crown on his head. He didn't remove it. He wore it with a quiet, solemn pride. Clara stood by the fireplace, a mug of hot chocolate in her hands, watching them. A feeling of profound peace and rightness settled over her. This was home. This strange, grand house had become their home, and this man, once a creature of shadow and silence, was the center of her world. She looked around the room, at the stockings hung on the mantelpiece, one for Julian, one for her, and one for Lily. And next to them, on a place of honor, sat two objects. One was a delicate, pearl-inlaid music box. The other was a slightly crumpled paper angel with a halo made from a pipe cleaner. They were not symbols of competing loves, but of a single, continuous story of a heart that had been broken, and then, miraculously, had learned to love again. Julian looked up from his castle, and his eyes met hers across the room. The love that passed between them was a silent, powerful current. It was a love forged not in perfection, but in the acceptance of flaws and the healing of old wounds. He had not forgotten Eleanor. He never would. Her memory was now a gentle, quiet light, not a raging fire. It was a part of his story, the chapter that had taught him the depths of love and loss, and had, in its own way, prepared him for this new, beautiful beginning. He rose from the floor and came to her side, wrapping his arms around her from behind. He rested his chin on her shoulder, and together they watched Lily, who was now carefully arranging her dolls inside the block castle. "I used to hate this night," he said softly, his voice a low murmur against her ear. "I thought it was the end of my story." Clara leaned back against him, her heart full. "It wasn't the end," she whispered. "It was just a very sad chapter. But the story wasn't over." He tightened his embrace, his heart overflowing with a gratitude so immense it almost hurt. He was no longer the man who hated Christmas. He was a man who had been lost in a blizzard of his own making, a prisoner in a cold, silent fortress. And then a little girl, a tiny angel in a puffy pink coat, had knocked on his door. She hadn't broken down the door. She hadn't stormed the castle. She had simply knocked and asked him a question, and in doing so, had shown him the way out. She and her mother had led him out of the winter and into the warmth. They had led him home.